This episode of the Unredacted Podcast is brought to you by Dragon Forge Consulting. Dragon Forge provides boutique consulting services for federal and commercial clients looking to expand their business in a turbulent time. Learn more by visiting their website at www.dragon-forge.net. That's www.dragon-forge.net. Week. But
Aren't
hey,
they all?
They all are. And Lindy, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Well, so in our running series of things that are interesting and people that we come across, we want to talk about speech in national security, specifically misdis malinformation, and what that means in national security contexts. And so we got a good guest. I'm not going to spoil who it is just yet because I have some questions for you. Okay. So can you consider speech as a weapon? Is speech a weapon?
Yes.
Oh, you say yes?
I wanted to, I don't want to spoil it, but in the pre-talk, Brian was like, obviously the answer is no. And I was like, this is why I love recording these with Brian, because whatever he thinks I'm going to say, I'm actually going to say the opposite once he presses the record button.
Yeah.
Life and death is in the tongue, according to Proverbs.
Whoa.
So I'm going to Bible you, since you record episodes at church sometimes. So I feel like if life and death is in the tongue, that means that speech is a weapon. So, and you think about it. I mean, I feel like the whole, like, sticks and stones can break your bones, words will never hurt you. Not true. Some of the most painful things. I mean, you're also talking to, okay, I'm going to get super spicy now, right?
Ready.
A woman who's been in an abusive marriage. And I will say, like, having encountered both physical and verbal abuse for a decade, the physical abuse was a lot easier. Mm-hmm. If somebody gives you the graciousness of pushing you into a wall, that's clarity. If someone calls you nasty words over years, that actually rewires your brain in a way that is almost impossible to get out from. So that's where I'm like, the things that we can do to each other in speech, and I think that's, okay, you got me on a soapbox here.
Ready.
That's why this political climate is so tough.
Yeah.
Because social media, all of that makes it so easy to use our words in a very divisive, angry, aggressive manner without, like, we record these podcasts, video on always, right? Looking at each other.
Yeah.
So even if we're saying something, you get those verbal cues. So much of our communication that we've instilled into our kids that we're doing ourselves doesn't have that benefit of seeing a face behind it, and people can be so mean and so harsh, including myself at times, and that's just, it's a weapon.
Well, you just tipped into something that I think really is what is creating that distance, right? I don't see the person on the other end of the keyboard when I send out that nasty tweet or message or whatever it is, you know. Right. So if you can do that, and it causes someone psychological harm, and there's really no accountability for that, right? I mean, there's people that have been talking about this all the time, comedians primarily. I think it's very interesting now because in the comedy space, that's kind of the test tube for really controversial ideas couched in humor, and sometimes it's not. Like if you think of like George Carlin and some of the things he was challenging in his time, like some of it wasn't funny, right?
Yeah.
It was just like, you know, why do we do this? It's kind of a strange thing that we do, and that's, he's kind of testing those bounds. But right now, comedians are doing that more and more often because they're saying, like, what are we doing to people? If somebody says something controversial, the reaction is to cancel them, right? And call their employer and get them fired. And, you know, I don't know if, you know what, no, I'm going to be more definitive. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think it's healthy. I think if someone has an idea and I want to test that idea, I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to get a reaction. And if the reaction's like, well, it's a pretty stupid idea,
Yeah.
Or for whatever reason. Or, man, that's a great idea. That's the type of thing we need. But we've created all this psychic distance. Like, how do I validate what it is I'm trying to say?
Well, and it's the general versus the specific, right? Like, I don't have any issues with what George Carlin says because he's saying it in a platform that he's been given, and you always have the choice to walk out or to stop watching or stop listening. Where it becomes difficult, and this is where, like, I disagree with the legal take on this, again, having dealt with this, verbal abuse is not abuse. I've also had, because of my vocation, internet stalkers, and people say terrible things to me, leave terrible voicemails, and that's covered by their free speech rights, which is painful. Having tried to, like, report some of this stuff to police before, and they're like, well, actually, unless they threaten to kill you, they can say whatever they want.
Yep.
I push back against that because, again, if it's, and it's one thing if it's general, like if somebody sent me a message, I hate all women, ugh, I can differentiate that when they're like, hey, Lindy Kaiser, I think blah blah blah, you blah blankety blank, all of that does have a very specific personal reaction, and actually the courts have said there's nothing I can do to prevent that unless they cross a certain threshold.
Right.
And that's where I do think that we have not, I don't think we have a context for this. And again, I'm not a legal expert, so maybe that's a future episode we bring somebody in, but I find that inability for people to be very specifically aggressive in their speech is something that I don't know. I just feel like it's escalated. Is it just me, or is it just the way the internet works that you just get a scale and scope of it a lot more?
Yeah, and I think, God, there's so much here. One piece I want to zero in on is what you're describing is an axiom we use all the time to do threat analysis, which was capability plus intent equals threat. So we say, if they verbally threatened me. Actually, what it is that they have the capability to do harm. We all have that, right? We all have that as humans. It's the utterance of, I intend to use my capability against you, intent. That's why it crosses a threshold, right? Even if they don't have the gun that they say, or they don't have the knife, or they don't have whatever. It doesn't matter. They could, right? It's within our ability to do it. So in this context, I am leaning more toward where you are as well. Like, isn't it different now? It's not a printing press. It's not the Federalist Papers. It's not. It's just a very different information environment, and I think the free speech protectors, enthusiasts, whatever you want to call them, they will say, well, bad speech just needs more good speech. So if somebody says something racist, then you need somebody who says something anti-racist, and then we reach a consensus somewhere on that topic. Maybe? What happens when I'm automating those harmful messages at a scale that's at the millions, and I'm just one person against the millions? You get drowned out. And it appears as if the majority of people hold the view that is being projected, but they don't. Like, that's the fundamental fabric of our reality that I feel is fraying, and we have to treat it more seriously, because if we're not trying to figure out, well, is this real, is it not, and we expect people to figure that out in a world of deep fakes and AI generated content, yeah, good luck. It's just getting better.
No, I get super anxious about this topic, right? Especially with young kids now. And that's the use of AI. They have these, AI friends now that you can make. And so for me, that comes down to what kind of information is that? And what is that? And we know a lot of those agents are coming out of China. So what inputs are they, this directly ties to national security and the intelligence community. And it's not on its surface level but you're like, if you are, trying to basically rewire the brain structure, the informational inputs that an entire generation of kids gets, that will have huge national security implications. And how do we tell what's true and what isn't? Like, I love this topic because I don't write a lot about dis, and malinformation, but every time I do, I get so much more feedback. People feel so strongly about this topic. And I think there is a reason for that, a reason why people have a guttural reaction on both sides saying, hey, you can't, to your point, like the information, it's a free flow, right? Anybody should be able to do whatever they want. We got to hear it all. Free speech. To the other side of it, that's, a lot of people, disagreement about what the terms even mean around those three and what's what. It's a spicy topic.
And we were, we've been very fortunate to get some good folks, and Jane agreed to do this. So this is Jane Kirtley that we interviewed. She is the Silla Professor of Media Ethics and Law at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. Yeah, somewhat in your backyard, but not quite there. Definitely in the Midwest. She directs that center, and she's a professor who's written Friend of the Court briefings for the U.S. Supreme Court and 2 books and some scholarly papers in regard to that. Those papers and books have been featured in the New York Times, The Conversation, and in The Guardian. So I feel like she's probably a preeminent expert in this field, and something she says very early in this is that although she is now a legal scholar, she started off in journalism. So her view of this is very different, and it does challenge some of the things that you and I are talking about. But I think it's important to kind of start talking about it, and we'll keep the conversation going, because that's how we get there from here. So this is our interview with Jane Kirtley. So
whatever.
Yeah.
I'm easy.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you making time here. So I was really jazzed about your article that you wrote, and it's a little older. It's from 2022.
Yeah, I was surprised when you raised it, because I don't think anybody's talked to me about it in 3 years. So interesting.
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Because you were tipping into things in 22 that were a little prescient, because now it's becoming a little more acute. Our data environment is getting a little more congested. It's a little harder to navigate, and now we're starting to learn some of the lessons that you wrote about. So I was excited to kind of grab you and to listen to what you had to say. So you're, as a guest here on our podcast, you're a different bird than we usually get, because we usually get folks who are national security practitioners, folks in the intelligence community, defense community. You're a lawyer. So could you give us a little bit about how you got into this space and what you find interesting about this?
Well, my background is that I actually started out as a journalist, and while I was working in Washington, D.C. as a correspondent for a newspaper in Tennessee, I was trying to cover the nuclear energy beat, for lack of a better term. This was many, many years ago. And I got very frustrated because I wasn't able to get the information that I wanted. And I had this idea that if I went to law school, I would learn how to get government information and then could go back and be a more effective reporter. But I ended up liking the law and the practice of law. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I went to a nonprofit organization called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And after about a year there, I became the director, and I was there for 14 years altogether. And, one of the big issues that we dealt with was government secrecy, and particularly government secrecy in the context of national security, because national security, and smarter people than me have made this point, that it's one of those claims that is easily made and very hard to disprove. Because if you need, for example, to get classified information to be able to demonstrate that the classification is improper or inappropriate or has expired or whatever, you can't get it. So you're in this endless, circle of trying to get information that will actually make your point, but you can't get it because of national security. So I've worked in many other areas involving media law, privacy, libel, access to courts, things like that. But I wrote a lot of articles when I was still at the Reporters Committee for a publication called Government Information Quarterly. And one of the things that I found really fascinating, and this again is evoking a very old case, was a book that was published in Britain by a former MI5 agent called Spycatcher, which the Thatcher government tried to stop. And what happened was that it was published here in the United States, and it effectively couldn't be stopped because even the Reagan administration was not going to allow a prior restraint on a book that was about MI5. So anyway, my point is I've been fascinated by this for a long time, and since
It's a good book.
I've been since 1999 I've been a professor at the University of Minnesota, teaching and researching in all these areas.
The supreme irony of that book, the Spycatcher book, is that because the British government made such a kerfuffle about it, to appropriate a British term, it became a super bestseller. Very, very popular because everyone wanted to know. And it's a fascinating read.
It's a classic, what we refer to as the Streisand effect, because of a case where Barbara Streisand tried to stop publication of photographs, aerial photographs of her beach house. And they had been published in this really totally innocuous environmental site, and it was just one of many, many photographs all up and down the California coast. But by demanding that it be taken down, she suddenly called attention to something that only a few kind of geeky people would have paid any attention to. And it's exactly the same thing with Spycatcher. And, the British government took the case all the way up to the law lords, which is as high as you could go, at least at that time, in Britain. And they ultimately ruled that the book could not be stopped.
Yeah, and especially going through the U.S., it's pretty hard to because you don't have the jurisdiction. But if we could start off for folks, like I've heard this debate in lots of different contexts, but I think it would be helpful for our listeners if you could help define a couple of key terms for us. And we're going to start with the first one, which is misinformation. What is misinformation?
Well, I think the general accepted definition of misinformation is information that is erroneous, but it's being spread due to honest error, honest mistakes, misunderstanding, or simply, if you think of it in terms of sort of traditional news reporting, you may provide what you got at the time, and then future events will show that perhaps that wasn't accurate in the long term. Typically, misinformation is not seen as a deliberate attempt to mislead. It's usually done in good faith, but it just happens to not be accurate.
You are misinformed, right? The root being, you don't fundamentally understand. I thought that, aliens lived on Mars. Well, you are misinformed. That is not true, right? That's okay. And so the next term of art that we hear is disinformation. What does that mean?
Well, that means information that is deliberately created and circulated with an intent to deceive. If you watch Antiques Roadshow, when they have a fake work of art, sometimes the expert will say, this was painted with an intent to deceive, to make people think it was a Rembrandt when it wasn't or whatever. And I think that's the easy way to think of this. It's when you are really setting out to deceive, to cause harm, or to manipulate people with information that you know is not true.
And then that brings us to our last term, malinformation. What is malinformation?
Now that's a term of more recent vintage, but essentially what it means is that you start with something that at least part of it is true, and then you manipulate it, change it, add hyperbole to it, take it deliberately out of context in a way that will make people come away from it thinking that what you're telling them is true, but in fact it's not. The simple example in traditional tort law, I think, would be the false light invasion of privacy. You shoot protesters with your camera at a demonstration or something, and then you use that video footage to totally mischaracterize what's going on there. So the video is truthful, but your interpretation or your representation of it is not. And I think this idea of malinformation is kind of a derivation of things like malware, the Latin root being something that's bad. And this is bad because, one of the things that sometimes comes up in traditional libel law is you'll have judges say, in some respects, it's even worse if most of your story is correct, but you've got one piece of it that is false and defamatory, because the reading public will think, because most of it's true, that all of it is true. So I would say that in that sense, that would be a classic example of malinformation.
Yeah, so we were talking about this article that you wrote in 22, and you, and I'll let readers, we're going to put the link into the show notes and folks can go back and read the article. But could you do a bit of a summary of what your argument is in this article and your kind of perspective on where we are in this malinformation spectrum and how that intersects the legal space?
Yeah, I mean, it's really relatively straightforward, I think, as a proposition. The point is, I think, that people don't like misinformation. They don't like disinformation. They don't like malinformation, and they think it should be stopped. But the devil's in the details, and the big detail is how do you figure out what falls under those categories. If the government is the arbiter of those things, there is a risk that the government will slap labels on things that are true or that the public has a clear right to know or some combination of those things and label it as misinformation, disinformation. Another aspect of this, which I think is what prompted the ACS to ask me to write this article, was that we can't deny the fact that there are foreign actors that are deliberately sort of salting social media with stuff that is disinformation, malinformation, with, in many cases, a desire to destabilize debate in our society, influence elections, all those kinds of things, which is not desirable, right? I mean, let's just stipulate those are not good things. But again, the problem is how do you stop it in a way that is not going to violate the First Amendment? And one of the problems has been that on the one hand, some of the hosting platforms have made attempts to ferret out this kind of information and take it down, but oftentimes they get pushback. In Europe, there is a much greater tolerance for the idea that social media platforms not only may, but should engage in this kind of vetting. And there are centers that are funded in the European Union that spend all their time looking for misinformation and disinformation, and they take it down without a bat of an eye. In this country, there's an obstacle to that, which is the First Amendment. And the way our law has been interpreted up until now has been to say that falsehoods in and of themselves, except in some very limited circumstances like fraud, for example, falsehoods are protected speech. And therefore, it's very hard to come up with a legal theory under which you can say you should take this down because it's not true. Again, if it's harming somebody's reputation, then you might be able to sue for libel. Or engaging in fraud. But, there was this case that's referred to as the Stolen Valor case that went before the Supreme Court some years ago, which involved a candidate for elective office who was basically lying about the military honors he had received, and people were trying to bring all these actions against him, including the military, saying that this was disrespectful to the military and undermining those who had legitimately gotten these awards and so forth. And the Supreme Court said basically he had a right to lie. And I think that is an example of how strongly our Supreme Court has upheld the idea that the remedy for speech that we find problematic is more speech. They said in that case, for example, that the military had all its resources available to publish on its website, to put out alerts, to do all kinds of things to say, no, this guy never got this. And that's the answer, the court said, not telling him he can't speak or that he could be punished for speaking. That is an example of what a big barrier there is in trying to compel anybody to remove fake information that is published on a social media platform.
So I guess the part, and when was the Supreme Court case for the Stolen Valor? Approximate decade?
Oh, I don't know. It was probably 15 years ago, maybe even a little longer.
So our digital environment was there, but it certainly wasn't as fast, wasn't augmented with artificial intelligence, didn't have what we now know to be state actors that are driving some of this now. So at that juncture, like, are we now facing something materially different that we have to think about in a different way?
Well, I think a lot of people believe that that is so, and they would also say that the kind of souped-up world of artificial intelligence and much more sophisticated algorithms has meant that the ability of bad actors to create and disseminate this kind of information, often undetected as being bad actors, has ballooned since the era of the stolen valor. I mean, in that case, we were talking about a guy that was holding a press conference and making these statements. It was a very, very different situation than what you and I are talking about right now. And that's what led to several cases back in 2024 that went to the Supreme Court that involved state statutes, Texas and Florida, that on the one hand were claiming that social media were censoring conservative ideas like anti-vax stuff, just as an example. I mean, there were many other things. And that this was impeding the First Amendment rights of those who wanted to post on those sites. What they went on to seek, the people that enacted these statutes, was law that would basically affirmatively require the platforms, to allow these kinds of things to be published, even if they believe them to be false. So it became a question of whose First Amendment rights are we talking about here? And part of the question was whether, especially because so many of the platforms actually do use algorithms in this vetting process, whether that was a First Amendment activity for them. And the Supreme Court really kind of left things in a mess because they sent these cases back, what we call remanded the cases, for new trials to try to do more fact-finding. There was a separate case that involved what's referred to as jawboning. And this was an allegation that the Biden administration was basically going to platforms and saying, take down this misinformation. And the argument was that that kind of pressure coming from the White House or the administration was going to basically scare platforms into complying with that over their better judgment. And ultimately, the court said, jawboning is okay as long as there's no clear retaliatory consequence to that, and that's going to be a case-by-case question. The interesting thing about the platforms is that in many respects, they really aren't subject to regulation the way a broadcaster is subject to regulation by the Federal Communications Commission, for example. There are ways that the administration, whichever one is in power, can go after them, but it's almost all in an adjacent way, like antitrust, for example. It's not directly related to the content, which means that it becomes kind of complicated to try to determine whether there really is a First Amendment problem with these kinds of actions or not.
So let me ask this question. In terms of constitutional law, the rights outlined by the American Constitution are given to American citizens. Do foreign nationals have protection under the First Amendment?
Yeah, because if you look at what the First Amendment says, and it's only 45 words, it says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech of the press. And then there are the other clauses that we don't have to talk about right now. It doesn't say, only U.S. citizens or only white men or, whatever. I mean, they may have been thinking in those terms, but that's not the way the amendment reads. And, the late Justice Black, Hugo Black, famously said that, in his view, the First Amendment was unequivocal, that it was absolute, that it says Congress shall make no law is no law. That's what it means. We don't need to discuss it further. That particular view has never commanded a majority of the Supreme Court, but I think it underscores the fact that the court takes a very expansive view of what constitutes protection for speech. And what you have to add into the mix is the fact that there have been many Supreme Court cases, starting in the 1970s and 80s, talking about political speech and how important it is to protect that, and even to protect anonymous political speech. I mean, people like Justice Scalia will go back to the founding documents of this country and say anonymous speech was key to how we became a nation. And very, very reluctant to say just because you want to operate anonymously, that means you shouldn't have these First Amendment protections. They say, yeah, of course you should, because it's an important part of discourse. And so over and over and over, we have the court saying in one way or another, the remedy is not to shut this speech down, it's to counter it with better speech or good speech, or however you want to characterize it. And I think there's great reluctance to go beyond that, except in very narrow, very specific examples like true threats, incitement. And the problem, if it is a problem, with dealing with provocative kinds of postings and so forth, is that usually the court will say that the immediacy of that is not readily apparent. It's not like standing in front of an armed mob and say, let's go and storm the Capitol. Not that anybody, of course, would ever do that. But the point is, if it's in a podcast, or if it's in Facebook or TikTok or something like that, you typically don't have people immediately going forward and reacting and engaging in unlawful acts, which is the key. You can incite people to lawful acts until the cows come home, and you would not be charged under an incitement statute. But the key is that they have the capability and the expectation that they will carry out illegal acts, which means, I think, that when we talk about foreign actors spreading misinformation and disinformation, you can often kind of draw a line between very provocative sorts of postings that vulnerable or easily persuaded individuals might react to. We see this all the time when there's been a shooting. Everybody's trying to figure out, well, what does this person's social media feed look like, and what might have influenced them. But that's different from saying that the things that they read or watched or listened to actually had a direct nexus to what they engaged in, because for the most part, if it's what we call abstract advocacy, that's not incitement.
So I'm going to drill into this a little bit, and if you'll allow me, I'm going to read from an intelligence community assessment that was published in 2017, and the title of the assessment was Assessing Russian Activities and Intentions in Recent U.S. Elections. The key judgment, the first one that was listed in there. So, when these things are assembled, obviously there's several judgments that have supporting evidence. It's a lot like a research paper. But the key judgment is usually the principal thing that has the most backing in terms of evidence. So what is written here, it says, we assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, who of course was running against President Trump at the time, and harm her electability and potential presidency. So kind of in that context, when we say there's free speech that's occurring, but it's being directed by a foreign adversary in this case, and we have evidence that clearly indicates that was the case, how so much so that it's eroding our fundamental democratic principles of how we elect leaders and discuss who's a better candidate for a given job. How does that interact with our conversation around protected speech? Or how should it?
Well, I think the problem is that oftentimes we deal in what I might call plausible deniability. And when you couple that with, again, the strong protection for political speech, because, however much I might personally deplore Russian or any other foreign actors' attempts to influence elections, the fact of the matter is they're engaging in political speech. And I think that's the rub, that's the problem, or the dilemma. And, for me, as an American, I might be really upset at the thought that any foreign actor is coming in and trying to influence how Americans are going to vote. But on the other hand, I used to do speaker and specialist work for the State Department. They sent me to other countries to talk about freedom of speech and freedom of the press and how important it was. So of course, the clear difference there is that was never covert. Everybody knew who I was and knew what I was there to talk about, and it wasn't done surreptitiously or anything like that. I think, again, the problem, there are ways and means to try to deal with this, and one of them might be that, think of the example, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. In order to own broadcast stations in this country, to have a license, you've got to be an American citizen. That is famously why Rupert Murdoch became an American citizen. He wanted to acquire Fox, as well as other outlets, and he couldn't do it without becoming an American citizen. And so that is a way where at least in the broadcast sphere, the Congress has attempted to mitigate against that problem. Going back to what we were talking about before, the ability of the government to regulate social media is much, much less. And I'm not saying they couldn't enact a law or they couldn't try to get the Supreme Court to say, yes, this is a medium that there ought to be government regulation for. But, the philosophy behind regulating broadcast was always that, well, broadcast is this very scarce spectrum. Everybody can't broadcast on radio or television frequencies. There has to be a traffic cop, that's the FCC, and they decide who gets to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. The gradual pulling back on regulation of BBC, of broadcasting, particularly during the Reagan administration, which is when it reached its height or nadir, depending on how you look at it, was that there was no longer any need to do that because we had many other kinds of platforms, and this was pre-internet really, but we had cable and we had satellite. And so you didn't need to be so protective of this particular electronic medium because there were comparable ones that were available with similar or even greater reach. But it was years ago, but in the ACLU versus Reno case, the Supreme Court said, speech on the internet enjoys the same protection as speech on the printed page, and that's as good as it gets under First Amendment jurisprudence. So I'm again old enough to remember when the questions were, does the government get to regulate dial-up porn?
Right.
Telephone communications, because the world is going to collapse if they don't. And that's the whole thing, that new technology is always used as the pretext for government to regulate. I mean, I'm sure the same thing happened with Gutenberg and his printing press. It's anything that's going to be able to reach the masses is something that governments are very skeptical about.
And technology always is faster than the legal process in
Absolutely.
every way.
Yeah.
And probably faster than anything else in our society, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
So you said something that I think we're starting to surround the issue with a couple of elements that require us to start to interrogate it a little bit. So you said in one example, American overt activities to say, these are our values, these are the things we believe, these are the things that we would like to see in this society emerge. Not being hidden, not being obscured, a part of the political lexicon, the discussion, and not and speakers, people being available to either defend or provide counter arguments to folks that have different views. I feel like that's above board. We all kind of understand that. That's good societal civil debate. But we are talking about, in this case, a foreign actor using their intelligence apparatus clandestinely to attack our democratic institutions and shape perceptions in ways that are favorable to their geopolitical endeavors. And it feels qualitatively different to me. And I guess the part that I'm starting to wonder about is, if we're entering a space where we start thinking about the information environment, especially the malicious piece of it we talked about at the beginning, where there's capability, the internet, AI, but it's intent. Intent is what matters. Is that kind of what you're starting to identify?
I think you're right, but I always have to have a cautionary observation on this, which is that's the same thing that Joe McCarthy and his buddies were saying during the Red Scare. You know, they created the book Red Channels to try to get people in the television industry fired because they were all, you know, closet communists that were working to undermine the American system as we know it. Same thing with Hollywood and the many, many actors and writers, particularly, and others who were driven into exile because they had joined the Communist Party in 1930 when they were still in college or something, and it was a very different Communist Party than it was during the Cold War. So I don't disagree with the concern, but I think, you know, there are people like Jeffrey Stone, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, who wrote a great book called Perilous Times that talks about these kinds of, you know, periods of crisis where we become, I don't know, willing, let's just say, to basically jettison First Amendment principles on the grounds that it is to protect a greater good. In saying that, I am not in any way minimizing the supposition you presented to me, that there is a genuine threat and there's a real concern about maintaining, you know, American values from these kinds of covert attacks on them. But I always circle back to the idea that there are steps that individuals can take and that platforms could take to try to mitigate these problems. I mean, we all, I think, if we're going to play in this playground at all, I think we have an obligation to educate ourselves, to become, you know, media literate, as we used to say, to be able to discern, separate the wheat from the chaff, figure out where it's coming from, and there are tools and just ways you can critically think to help yourself combat that. And I mean, I've been told sometimes, well, that's a very Pollyanna approach, and it's just assuming that people are going to take the time to do that. And as they're dealing with this onslaught of information coming from so many platforms, and in many cases choosing not to look at legacy media that actually do vet information, that actually do make an effort to try to determine whether a claim is true or false, and are just going with whatever seems most attractive or simplest. I'm not saying that these are easy things to do or that it's simple to convince people that they need to do them, but ultimately that's where the personal responsibility needs to rest, I believe, because of the danger of government. And when I say government, I mean anybody's administration. I'm not talking specifically about Trump. It could be anybody. If government has the tools to basically shut down communications on the grounds that they're coming from a foreign power and they're contrary to, I don't know, American principles, that is giving them a very, very long leash to engage in activity that could ultimately censor information that the public has an interest in and a right to know about. So, as I said before, the devil's in the details. We could say, ideally, this ought to be possible, but it presumes, and I think I said this in the article, it assumes good faith on the part of the government. And history tells us that government doesn't always act in good faith. So, you know, who are you going to trust? Who are you going to believe in? A lot of people would say, well, I'm going to trust the American government before I would trust Russia or China. But there are other people who would say the exact opposite. They'd say, I will never trust the government completely, and maybe the Chinese or the Iranians, or take your choice, are actually telling us stuff that our own government doesn't want us to know. And that's the dilemma.
It also, you know, we have already entered a space where the data that we are absorbing is not easily discerned as real, right? I mean, I'm not holding a phone right now, but the phones that we have now, modern smartphones, I can take a picture and I can alter that picture so that it can, or I can take a video and I can alter it so that at the point of capture, it doesn't show what actually occurred. I can change the color of people's shirts. I can change their exterior. I can change facial features. It's not real. And we're asking folks to discern at a, you know, I don't know how long you spend staring at pictures on the internet, but I don't spend more than a couple of seconds. You're asking folks to discern within a couple of seconds that's real and that's not real?
Well,
And
I think what I'm asking them to do is to not take things at face value.
there you go.
That's the thing. I mean, yes, I'm not saying that everybody is equally sophisticated, and certainly the advent of deep fakes, which are getting better and better and more sophisticated, makes this not an easy thing to do. But, talking to my students, I would just say something as simple as, have you been able to confirm this from another source? Pick your other source. But, I mean, I have a relative who, we sometimes get into arguments about sort of what is true, what is accurate, and she will say, well, I get my information from different sources than you do. And on one level, I would say, fair enough. If you got a credible source that contradicts what I just said to you, I would like to see that, because I don't want to be misled, and I certainly don't want to be continuing to disseminate inaccurate information. I have no reason to want to do that. It's quite the opposite. So I think that it's kind of the credulity issue of people that are simply highly susceptible, highly persuadable by a sophisticated video or whatever the case might be, and just taking it at face value. And the old line about the State's News Service in Chicago was, if your mother tells you she loved you, check it out. And that's deeply imbued in me, because that's the way I learned it when I was in journalism school at Northwestern. And so on a very more elementary level, if it seems too good to be true, it probably
isn't. Yeah.
And I guess that's the thing that, and this is way beyond my areas of expertise, but I think the kind of hypnotic quality of some forms of social media, and the fact that people are death scrolling and just they're not even processing it in any kind of sophisticated way, they're just absorbing it, taking it as true. That's a problem that I think is way beyond what you and I are talking about right now, because I don't see a ready fix for it beyond. I keep hoping that the digital natives generation are going to be, more skeptical about the things that they see. I'm not sure that that's the way that's happening, but logically it should be, because you think somebody that's an old person, like me, who didn't grow up with it, might, because I'm used to conventional kind of media that do vet and go out of their way to be accurate. I just assume that anybody that's using these platforms is doing the same. I don't, but I think that's the idea, that boomers, do that sort of thing. But you would think the younger generations would understand, because many of them are adept themselves at manipulating the messages that they create, would understand how easy that is to do and how you can't take things at face value.
I think it's you've really unpacked that well. I appreciate you doing that. To me, I think my larger point is the fabric of our reality is shifting in a way that we can't fully predict, and because of that, we're going to have some sort of check and balance. So the traditional way you were mentioning about like journalistic integrity, it's like I'm the New York Times, I'm the Wall Street Journal, whatever. I publish an article, and I'm like, God, we put that source in there, and it turns out they were lying the whole time. We're going to have to issue a retraction. Now, the retraction rarely is on the front page, right? It's always on the back page in a very small box, and you're going to correct that. But they go through the effort. They actually say, that's not true. This is true. So we've come, as you and I grew up, we came to appreciate, like, that is how we pull into check malinformation. We're now in a data consumption environment where there's so much, and it's so easily manipulated, either for entertainment value or for some other malicious purpose. We're going to have to rethink the model of what it takes to do it. So you wrote a little, I'm looking here at your article now, and you wrote, and I think it was a nice summary of what you've been talking about. The core teaching of New York Times v. Sullivan, which was the court case that we focused in on, that is essential. We should not leave it to government to be the arbiter of truth. In civil society, we want to presume that government is acting in good faith, but history teaches us that legislation intended to preserve and protect truth could become an instrument to suppress it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality. And again, if we lived in an ideal world where government was always benign and put the public interest at the top of the table, then I might feel more comfortable with the notion of government deciding what's true and what's false. But we know that's not the case. I've done work on free expression and data privacy, particularly in the European Union, and they have created these task forces that comb the social media ecosystem to try to find stuff that they believe is disinformation or malinformation or whatever it is, and they take it down, and they're very proud of this, and they'll tell you that we have highly skilled academics usually from a variety of disciplines who are going to do this, and it's all going to be great because it's going to protect the public interest. And the fact of the matter is we're dealing with human beings who bring in their own agendas, their own prejudices, and it's just not as fail-safe as they would suggest that it is. And it would be clearly unconstitutional in this country to try to set up something comparable to that here.
Well, this has been really incredible. I've really appreciated I commend the article to everyone. Again, we're going to put it in the show notes so people can go and read it. Very thoughtful piece at that intersection of what does our legal society here work on, and then how do we interact in the geopolitical context. And you've really provided us a nice wrap up here, Jane. So I really do appreciate it, and thanks for coming on the Unredacted podcast.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Lindy Kaiser.
And I'm Brian Drake.
And this has been the Unredacted Podcast.